The lead figure Sha Rei alongside his two companions Yakagi Sum and Ano Mizuki discovered themselves in an unfamiliar location and questioned if they were uninjured. Su nonetheless experienced soreness across his spine, whereas Mizuki was entirely unharmed since she had been cradled in Rai's embrace. Following his gentle placement of her on the ground, the trio all started to interrogate the abrupt transformation of their environment. Rai believed that the predicament closely mirrored the tale within the volume that Mizuki had brought along. Our group grew solemn upon perceiving this truth, and when they glanced downward, they uncovered a massive arcane array. It perfectly mimicked the classic plotline of getting transported into an alternate realm with the objective of toppling a demon deity. Seconds afterward, they spotted a faraway glow and comprehended that the terrain was completely distinct from their native land, rendering the crisis undeniably authentic. In order to verify this, Su tried to strike a nearby support column and easily shattered it, noting that he somehow felt far more powerful than previously. As they proceeded with their dialogue, Mizuki posited that they might have turned into legendary champions. She wondered if Rai was the primary savior, but Sumem experienced no specific alteration within his own body. Mizuki likewise felt identical. Su then requested Mizuki to recollect any specifics from the romance regarding what normally transpired in such occurrences. Following a brief reflection, she clarified that they would probably activate a back toggle that would convey them straight into an underground labyrinth. Nonetheless, Su appeared perplexed by her commentary as it seemed ambiguous and completely out of context. He cross-examined whether any of it was genuinely factual or if they were somehow destined to be liberated. Mizuki replied that they might ultimately encounter a formidable adversary or get entangled in a domestic conflict. She maintained that this was merely the prelude and that the ruling powers of this realm might already be participating. Abruptly, they detected nearing paces. Su motioned the others to stay silent, projecting that someone was arriving, and Ragi experienced the identical suspense. Shortly thereafter, two maidens flanked by numerous armed guards walked toward them. They traded looks, and one of the maidens observed that she had anticipated solely a solitary savior. The alternative girl, who seemed to be a sorceress, concurred but voiced bewilderment regarding the attendance of extra persons, implying that it could have been a blunder that dragged extra folks along. Mizuki became progressively anxious regarding the circumstances, while Sue watched the events with complete skepticism, since it was far past their calculations. Stunned and panicked, Mizuki suddenly blurted out that anyone who wasn't picked as a savior would finish up signing a pact with a malicious deity to combat their old savior partner. Sui mocked the notion, wondering what a malicious deity even constituted and why something so ridiculous would show up. Mizuki was startled by his counteraction and confessed that she wasn't completely certain herself. All the same, she appended that if she found herself in such a plight, she would never assault Ragi since she harbored no animosity toward him. The moment she uttered this, her face turned red. Spotting her bashfulness, Su told her not to take for granted that Rai was the savior, playfully adding that he himself might finish up signing a pact with a malicious deity to battle Rai. Rigi, clearly perplexed, interrogated Sue whether he was genuinely plotting to execute such a pact. In reply, Sue feigned an ominous demeanor, proclaiming that the hour had arrived to disclose the reality. He theatrically asserted that he had always viewed Rai as an individual who merited being blasted away. Rai became even more baffled by Sue's eccentric conduct. At that juncture, a royal lady cut in on them, expressing regrets for dragging them there so suddenly. She identified herself as Titania Root Ale, the secondary royal lady of the Ale Empire and the offspring of monarch Almadia's Root Ale. She then presented the female standing next to her as Felinia Stingray, the palace sorceress accountable for invoking them. Sue briefly eyed the royal lady prior to offering appreciation to her for the formal greeting. He then introduced himself along with Mizuki and the remaining folks. Tatana advanced to clarify the rationale for invoking them. She affirmed that they required their assistance in destroying the commander of the fiends, Nakshatra, who was currently endangering the tranquility of the whole planet. Every single one of them responded with letdown since they had already foreseen the predicament. Tatana seemed baffled, wondering why they appeared unmoved regardless of everything that had transpired. Even so, they ultimately consented to the plea. Nonetheless, at that juncture, Suime was the solitary individual who declined. Soon afterward, they were escorted before the monarch Alma. In his attendance, Su resolutely declared that he would not battle against massive hordes of adversaries, which was why he had no objective of accompanying the other two. His noncompliance startled everyone since it was unanticipated for an individual who was assumed to be the savior's peer. Hordes found his position remarkably audacious. Still, at the identical moment, it was regarded as deeply irreverent to reject the monarch's plea. On the flip side, we assumed that the remaining folks were only talking so boldly because they were out of harm's way and that he himself was no different from them. Rai called out to him, but Sui offered regrets, clarifying that he did not wish to become entangled in something that might cause his demise. Regi replied that Sui was merely anxious about his safety, adding that whenever his own capability had fallen short, Sui had always been there to back him up. Catching this, Sue prompted Regi to reflect prudently. He indicated that these individuals were requesting him to face an entity who had already annihilated a whole mighty realm, and that if Rai harbored any misgivings or pause, he ought not to welcome such a load. It was subsequently clarified that Rai might genuinely be the savior, since he seemed to hold the celestial primordial safeguard that branded him as such. By way of comparison, the remaining folks appeared to have been invoked alongside him purely by happenstance. This merely left Sui more perplexed about the state of affairs. Monarch Alma then declared that they would initially be seated at a banquet gathering in the Great Room, and that once the arrangements were finished, they would debate the principal topic the subsequent day. Nonetheless, Rai spoke to the monarch, affirming that he desired to debate the topic instantly. Sui, mystified by this, softly questioned Rai why he was contemplating such a path, adding that even if the monarch had requested it, they were not bound to reply immediately. Rai told Sui to cede the situation to him, and even when Sui attempted to stride forward, Rai did not halt. Our bro Sui pondered that the notion of eradicating a fiend monarch in an alternate realm felt nearly like a fantasy, and entering combat with an adversary whose capabilities were unidentified was not an intelligent choice. Furthermore, he had not yet accomplished his pledge to, until he completed it, he could not afford to pass away. In the meantime, a gentleman related a chronicle to Rei and Mizuki. He clarified that roughly 3 realms to the northward of Asda sat a domain recognized as Nocius, a territory of biting chill. It had once constituted the boundary between fiend and human zones, and was viewed as the northernmost bastion of humankind, which had repelled fiend raids for a lengthy duration. Nonetheless, roughly half a year prior, an abrupt and rapid offensive by the fiends had shattered the capital city, and the regime of Nocius had fallen and faded away. Absorbing this, Mizuki seemed anxious regarding the populace and the senior citizens. The gentleman clarified that the fiends possessed no requirement to capture humans as captives. Conversely, they pursued humans down and slaughtered them, leaving mere handfuls of survivors. He additionally affirmed that the fiends looked down on humans, treating them like bugs, and their dominance reached past mere physical power. Humankind was not even in a stance to parley with them. He proceeded to state that, matching the words of the Redemption Order, a supreme fiend had been elected to stand for all fiends, and that supreme fiend was named Nakshatra. If the fiends were left unmonitored, humankind might already have been wiped out, or would soon encounter total annihilation, as predicted by the prophecy of humanity's ruin. Extending his commentary, the gentleman stated that every realm had attempted to forge defensive measures against the fiends, but all endeavors had collapsed. Consequently, states had fallen back on invoking saviors from an alternate world, a historically sacred strategy. He appended that the planet was presently fraught with perils as recorded through the ages. Behemoths that consumed distinct beasts had shown up twice, despots had surfaced on 2 occasions, and supreme fiend incursions had transpired twice as well, totaling 6 grand catastrophes. To evade such perils, the populace had executed the savior invocation rite once more. Upon perceiving how drastic the hazards were, Rai and Mizuki seemed increasingly worried and wondered if they themselves might be invoked. The senior gentleman concurred, stating that though the march of the Fiend Legion had momentarily decelerated, ahead, all the states of the planet might be sacked by infinite fiends, precisely as had occurred to Nocius. It was perceived that the action was designed to harvest compassion. The monarch then interrogated Rai whether he was prepared to embrace the request. Mizuki presumed that Rai would decline, but to her astonishment, Rai declared that he would embrace it. Sue was stunned upon perceiving this and yelled forcefully, shocking both the monarch and the gentleman present. He was subsequently asked what was wrong with his head. Sue replied furiously, stating that he had amplified his voice due to what he deemed Rai's idiocy, and questioned if Rai had genuinely weighed it thoroughly before consenting. He contended that Rai had been requested to slaughter an immensely hazardous entity that threatened to collapse the world, and that doing so would mean confronting hundreds of fiends. Suime condemned Rai for accepting such an obligation without weighing his or Mizuki's sentiments. In reply, Rai clarified that numerous individuals were in peril due to the Supreme Fiend, and that the populace of that realm had cried out for a savior. He stated that this was the rationale he had been invoked and why he planned to take up the mission. Sume strongly protested, maintaining that they owed absolutely nothing to those folks. Regi recognized this, noting that it was their initial time in this realm, but he appended that all human existences were linked in some manner. He further mused that existence itself had not initially stood, but had been fashioned, suggesting a mutual bond among all. Though Sue partially concurred, he contended that it still did not vindicate Rai confronting such a load solo. Rai confessed that he did not completely comprehend everything yet, but said that he felt a massive energy residing within himself and trusted that with its backing, he might be capable of defeating the supreme fiend. Sui grew increasingly annoyed and observed that Rai might not even prevail, reminding him of the reality that conflicts were ultimately settled by headcount. He pressed Rai to reflect practically, pointing out that a solitary individual could not crash a massive legion, regardless of how robust they were. Notwithstanding this, Rai stayed resolute in his choice, stating that they would not comprehend the resolution unless they attempted. He voiced his trust that those who had been invoked held the capability to salvage the planet. Sum still declined to embrace this logic. Regi then stated that while the resolution was dubious, he could not turn a blind eye to folks who were hurting. He appended that if Sum did not wish to become involved, he ought not to compel himself. However, Regi comforted him that his attendance alone would grant him certainty, since he himself had been bestowed the capability of a savior. Catching this, our bro Sui was left completely dumbfounded. Subsequent to that, Sui addressed the monarch, stating that he held a desire and asking if the monarch would be inclined to hear it. Everyone was startled by his style of talking to the monarch, but the monarch authorized him to go on. Sui then voiced that he was willing to assist in eradicating the supreme fiend on the proviso that they would send him back to his native world afterward. In reply, the monarch offered regrets and clarified that sending them back to their world was unfeasible since no strategy to do so had been uncovered. May tried to calm himself and offered regrets, saying that he had not perceived clearly and requested the monarch to restate his remarks. The monarch then made clear that the incantation needed to send them back to their world did not exist, and consequently they held no strategy for returning them. Absorbing this, Su shouted in total skepticism, questioning whether they were genuinely serious. Later on, when Su was resting in his chambers, Rai interrogated Mizuki whether he would be perfectly fine. Mizuki replied that Su would be all right. Regi appended that it was Sumame they were discussing, and that he would likely mend and be back to normal by the subsequent day. Though Mizuki said she anticipated so, Su on the alternative side stayed lost in contemplation, unyielding in his resolve to discover a strategy to return to his household regardless of the cost. By the subsequent day, inside Chamlea Citadel, Regi and Mizuki were staying expectant at the open-air sparring fields. Soon, Tatania and Felmania walked in alongside several sentries. Tatana offered regrets for keeping them waiting and stated that she would present the palace sorceress who would evaluate Rai's mystical capabilities. She presented Felmania initially. Felmania greeted them once more, humbly clarifying that she might not be the most learned among the palace sorceresses, but she anticipated becoming familiar with Ri. Rai briefly goggled at her grand stature, which caused Felmania to become slightly perplexed. Observing this, Rai turned red and rapidly comforted her that it was nothing and that he was fine. Felmania then asked if she could query regarding something. She recollected that Rai had noted that his world lacked incantations. Rai validated this, clarifying that his world depended on a structure of understanding recognized as science. Felmania seemed mystified and stepped nearer, her inquisitiveness expanding as she questioned if that was genuinely the reality. Regi made clear that though the term sorcery stood in their vocabulary, it solely surfaced in legendary tales and not in actuality. Even so, Felmania found it tough to embrace and asked once more if he was certain. At that juncture, a gentleman cut in, observing that such constant interrogation might be deemed discourteous toward the protector of their world. Felmania instantly offered regrets, clarifying that it was her initial time meeting someone from a planet without incantations. Mizuki then implied that it would be supportive for someone to properly clarify sorcery to Rei, and she trusted Felmania was the most fitting sorceress in the realm for the task. Tatana backed this concept and requested Felmania to assume the obligation. Perceiving herself lauded as the premier sorceress made Felmania turn red, while Rai voiced his gratitude, saying it would truly be supportive. However, another gentleman stepped forward from behind and objectified, claiming that he was far more suited than Felmania to instruct Rei in sorcery. Felmania faced him down, asking whether he was hinting that she was lesser in mystical capability. The gentleman replied that he desired the instructing post at the Sorcery Association and held certainty in his background. He appended that Felmania was still youthful and might not yet equal his standard. In reply, Felmania put forward that they evaluate their capabilities to settle who was more fitting. The gentleman concurred. Felmania then turned to Titania for authorization, and Titania permitted the exhibition, stating that it would uncover who was dominant in both sorcery and its clarification. The gentleman started by exhibiting an incantation. He intoned for the ground to cluster and transmute into a mighty impact capable of crushing an enemy. As the incantation took form, everyone watched in shock. He clarified that this was what they dubbed sorcery, the capacity to direct mystical components that form their planet and discharge capability through them. Regi found the clarification tough to seize as the notion felt ethereal. Felminia observed that such a clarification would indeed be tough to comprehend for an individual from a planet without sorcery. She then resolved to exhibit in her own manner without complex intoning. Felinia invoked blazes, creating a glowing exhibition across the zone. In doing so, she even scorched a segment of the gentleman's mantle, pointing out that he had merely been talking rather than exhibiting productively. The spectators were dumbfounded, and Mizuki observed that Felminia was genuinely spectacular, explicitly noting the rarity of her pale blazes. At that juncture, Raggy started to comprehend the core of sorcery. Felminia clarified that elemental capability was the cornerstone of all creation, capable of yielding various occurrences. She outlined how warmth derived from fire, how chill could be experienced through water, and how by vividly picturing such impressions, one could harvest those capabilities. She pushed Rai to envision the grand mystical reservoir within himself and utilize it. As she gently grasped his hand and urged him to go on, Rai tried to follow her direction. To his shock, he managed to yield a tiny display of sorcery. The gentleman, enraged by this, shouted that it was not finished yet and readied to discharge a more mighty incantation. Felminia instantly stepped forward to block Rai, directing him to remain behind her. Following that, Felinia discharged a mighty offensive, fusing gale and blaze into a cyclone-like flash that brought the skirmish to a conclusion. Watching this, Tatana observed that they had ultimately uncovered an appropriate preceptor for Rai. While Su was recovering, Rai went to visit him and observed that Felminia was genuinely spectacular, implying that Su ought to come and watch for himself. However, Sui declined, clarifying that he had stirred up friction in front of the monarch and consequently felt it was wiser not to display himself there. Regi, still thrilled, chatted about how mighty Felminia's sorcery was and lauded her instruction, saying that it was incredibly productive. Around that period, Mizuki likewise walked in and appended that Felinia was the most youthful among the palace-appointed sorcerers. She noted that Tatana had once clarified how at the age of 15, Felinia had seized the true core of sorcery and was viewed as the most hopeful genius in their domain. Mizuki further clarified that the trait of Felminia's blazes, explicitly her unique pale blazes that could incinerate through anything, was something no one had ever fulfilled previously. It was this identical capacity that had earned Felminia the moniker of the Pale Blaze. Catching all this, our guy Sui started to comprehend and wondered how an individual could command such sophisticated sorcery. In reply, Ray exhibited what he had mastered by intoning and yielding blazes that swept across the chambers, leaving Sui startled. Suj observed that Rai truly appeared like an authentic savior. Rai, slightly flustered, clarified that alongside sorcery, he had likewise been getting some drills in bladecraft and combat systems. Mizuki observed once more on how magnificent Felinia was and voiced her trust that at this speed, Rai might soon be capable of battling at a standard close to hers. However, Rai dismissed this, stating that Felinia had likely been restraining herself against him. Shortly subsequent, Mizuki abruptly comprehended that it was nearly the hour for their post-noon drill segment. Rai was startled at how tardy it had turned and rapidly offered regrets to Sui, clarifying that they required to exit for drills. Sui told them to proceed. As Rai was exiting, he cheered Sui not to remain shut up in the room and implied that he ought to at least exit for a stroll. As Rai exited, Sum pulled away the quilt from the mattress under which he had been concealing several volumes. He felt unburdened that he could now read concerning the Savior's invocation capability since he had collected many pertinent documents from the Citadel repositories. However, he comprehended that merely banking on volumes would not generate any authentic outcomes. He resolved that extra scrutiny was vital and stepped outside, noting to himself that it was quite fishy he had not been busted yet, especially since protection had already been cranked up. For someone attempting to stay undetected, wandering outside so uninhibitedly felt eccentric, though the protection itself seemed standard. Gazing around both flanks of the zone and discovering everything unvaried, he was shocked as he realized that he had lost his bearings and held no alternative route. He resolved that he would exit and request someone for guidance. Spotting someone walking past, Sui neared and pardoned himself. It proved to be Felminia, who rotated around and identified him. Sui asked if she was Reggie's preceptor, and she validated, asking what he was executing there. He countered that he was simply wandering around for a shift of environment. Felmania observed that taking a breather was an excellent thing, but since he was unacquainted with the hallways inside the Citadel, it would be wiser for him to have someone flank him if he aimed to exit. Sui replied that he would bear that in mind. She then resolved to escort him and noted that she would display the path to his chambers in case he got bewildered. Sui thanked her for the exertion. Abruptly, Felmania asked why he had declined to battle the Supreme Fiend. Su paused. She went on, pointing out that Rai was his companion, yet he had opted not to back him up. Even though Mizuki had consented, and everything had been transparently outlined by the monarch, Suj replied that he simply did not wish to put his life in jeopardy, which was why he had declined to join them. Upon perceiving this, Felinia observed that he was a contemptible human. Perplexed, Soom listened as she extra blasted him, saying that he was a chicken who egoistically permitted his companions to shoulder all the load and that he held no privilege to call himself a companion of the Savior. Soom requested her to discard those indictments and questioned whether it was not instinctive to decline, taking into account they had suddenly been hauled to an unfamiliar zone and asked to combat. He contended that such a reaction was typical for mankind. Felinia, however, wondered whether he would still experience the same even after understanding that it was a savior's invocation. Sue stated that as a regular person, he had not arrived there for their benefit. He maintained that he was merely a casualty trapped in a mishap triggered by them. He appended that he did not comprehend what principles they maintained regarding savior invocation, but he trusted he held neither accountability nor duty toward any of them. Efminia listened and said that she grasped his remarks, but she questioned whether that likewise signified he felt no duty toward his companions. She pointed out that he himself had once stated that the rationale he could not match them was his shortage of merit, and yet he had still opted to remain beside them. Weighing all of that, she observed that she could solely view him as a powerless fellow, someone who could have backed them in his own manner, even without any freakish capabilities, while the remaining two were executing their slice. Yet regardless of that, he had opted not to stand with them. Sue was startled and wondered if she was infuriated on behalf of Ragi and Mizuki. At first, he assumed she was merely thrusting her principles on him, but he comprehended that she was genuinely a decent individual. He offered regrets. Fulminia grew annoyed and asked if he had even been paying attention to her. Soom requested that she drop her volume, saying that it might bother others and that he could perceive her perfectly fine without her yelling. She offered regrets for amplifying her voice, but appended that she would certainly amend what she dubbed his chicken attitude. Sue turned perplexed, wondering how the crisis had climbed to that point. Just as she was set to go on, she abruptly dropped to her knees, bewildered about what had transpired. Sue, equally perplexed, observed that he had merely been standing there paying attention to her. Abruptly, Felmania became tangled in her own vestments and started flailing, unable to extricate herself. Realizing that he held no alternative choice, Soom stepped forward to assist and requested her to relax. He carefully untangled her and then asked if she was perfectly fine. Subsequent to that, he eyed her face and spotted how grimy it had turned. Extracting a tissue, he gently wiped the grime away, offhandedly observing that she was quite an exertion. A split second later, Felinia shrieked forcefully, demanding to comprehend what he was doing. We may countered that she had been in a jam, so he had assisted her. She rejected that she had required his assistance and questioned why he had executed such an action without her authorization. Sui replied that abandoning her in that condition would have been a squandery of her pretty face, which was why he had cleansed it. Catching this, Felinia turned heavily red. Sui, perplexed, wondered what was amiss. Shifting her gaze away while still red-faced, she hesitantly questioned whether he genuinely believed she was pretty. Sue, still mystified, asked once more what was amiss. Shocked, she abruptly amplified her voice and proclaimed that it was plenty, saying she held alternative duties to handle and required to exit. As she readied to exit, Sue wondered how he would discover his bearings. Felmania told him that he ought to stride straight down the hallway and rotate at the termination. She appended that if he still could not discover his bearings, he ought to request someone else for assistance. Sue felt perplexed and annoyed as he actually desired to discover his path to the spot where they had been invoked rather than head back to his chambers. The whole crisis seemed tedious to him. Right then, Felinia abruptly returned and amended herself, saying that she retracted a segment of what she had stated previously. However, she appended that he ought to still recall one item, that she would surely pay back the shame he had triggered her 100-fold. She cautioned him not to lose sight of it and then dashed away. Sui stayed perplexed and started reflecting about how to discover his path along the unfamiliar corridor. After walking some interval, Felminia halted, reflecting on how shameful the crisis must have been, displaying herself like that in front of Soom. Meanwhile, Felinia, who had exited earlier, found herself turning red once more as she recollected his observation about her being pretty. She tried to brush the reflection away, but she additionally started to experience that leaving him alone without properly escorting him had been impolite. Due to that, she resolved to head back and express regrets. When she arrived at his chambers, she tapped on the door, but there was no reply. She started to wonder if he was still lost. Glancing inside, she spotted several volumes strewn across the mattress and comprehended that he had been studying something. Recollecting the spot where Sue had been invoked, she thought he might have gone there and resolved to inspect. At the invocation hall, Sue was indeed present, standing near the mystical array with several volumes in his hands. He observed to himself that he would commence his studying once more. A sentry was executing his standard rounds, walking along his designated path as he surveyed the northern tower. Everything appeared to be orderly. As he went on, he wondered whether matters would calm down soon. doubting that anyone would be foolish enough to risk an offensive on a citadel where the savior lived. He questioned the actual requirement to guard someone who could combat on identical terms with the commander of the warriors. Abruptly, he detected a noise from behind and rotated to inspect if someone was present. His eyes fell upon a sentry standing near the invocation chamber. The warrior recollected that he had already surveyed that zone previously. He briefly weighed the odds of an infiltrator, but rapidly dismissed the reflection, accounting that the domain's high-tier protection mystical gear fashioned by Hakuin could not possibly be cracked so effortlessly. Shaking it off, he rotated and went on his path, noting to himself that he had been spooked for no rationale and that everything was clear. Not far off, our bro Bume stood concealed, feeling slightly irritated. He thought about how narrow the crisis had been and assumed that the sentry would likely drop it from memory by the subsequent day. What annoyed him extra was the attendance of the mock plate armor, which he had wrecked instantly. He noted that such mechanized guards had not been present the previous time, guiding him to infer that they had been freshly set up more as a bother than an authentic hazard. Monitoring the plate armor more intensely, Soom dissected that it was a variant intended to suck up mystical capability from its environment. Furthermore, it held both counter-mystical and robust physical shielding, rendering it a fairly tough apparatus. Suem recollected what had occurred previously and felt unburdened that the apparatus had not been mighty enough to actually terminate someone. He mused that he could not simply assert that Felmania owed him anything, explicitly since she had transparently aimed to pay back the shame he had triggered her multiple times over. At the identical moment, he comprehended that in a turbulent planet like this, it was not odd for a sorceress to wipe out anyone who dared to trespass upon a studying zone. If that was genuinely her objective, then he would have to fashion proper countertactics against her. Utilizing his sorcery, Sui mended the wrecked plate armor and fixed it to its primal state. Succeeding to do so effectively, he felt a silent sense of reliance in his own capabilities. However, he knew that the authentic issue rested in the mystical array inside the invocation chamber. Recollecting his earlier attempt to dissect it, he remembered that the method backing it was still past his grasp. The exterior array appeared to be linked to backing and resolve rather than defense, which merely deepened his confusion as to why it had not yet achieved its planned objective. He additionally started to wonder how, or even if they would be capable of returning to their native world. The setting relocated to the hearing hall where Felmania reported everything to the monarch. However, the monarch declined to accept her anxieties, and he stated that both Su and Rei were vital visitors of the domain and that they could not be harmed under any pretext. Felinia clarified that she was not implying harming Sui, but she maintained that his conduct was highly fishy. She clarified that while he made it appear as though he stayed shut up in his chambers, he was actually shifting uninhibitedly around the citadel and had even utilized numerous volumes from the repositories. Almeida weighed this and implied that perhaps Su was helpless to return to his native world and was therefore trying to gather more about it in his own style. He appended that shifting around the citadel was not restricted for him. Felmania then indicated that there were transparent signs of Suime accessing forbidden zones of the repositories as well as the invocation chamber itself. Felmadia's was startled, noting that such zones could not typically be accessed through regular sorcery. The monarch then concurred and underscored that Sum had been capable of entering those spots with comfort. He extra mentioned that he had gathered from Rhea that sorcery did not stand in their world. However, on the day she invoked them, she had perceived that Su was utilizing sorcery. She trusted that he had definitely executed some sort of spell at that interval, which had left her deeply mystified. She cautioned that if they proceeded to overlook his deeds, it could injure the status of the domain, and she maintained that he ought to be lectured. Almedios, however, stayed dubious. He replied that there was no requirement for such step unless Suimi constituted an actual hazard to the domain. Felinia, startled by his position, questioned his logic regarding Sum's trespass into the forbidden repositories. Almedios clarified that the restricted repositories held only past records and charts, so there was no real hazard. He appended that the identical logic counted for the invocation chamber. Since Su had been invoked by them and was helpless to return to his own world, it was only equitable to grant him some latitude. He further implied that Su might even uncover something that had previously slipped past them. Felmenia replied that if they authorized Suimi to operate uninhibitedly, it might injure the monarch's standing. Almedias, however, disclosed that he did not explicitly fret about such concerns. He then observed that it seemed Soe had been monopolizing her reflections quite a bit. Felmania instantly rejected it, but Almario noted that it was tough to trust otherwise. Comprehending what he was hinting, she grew slightly flustered, while Almario's offhandedly appended that being a youthful prodigy must be quite testing for her. At that juncture, a gentleman neared and pardoned himself. Felinia turned to him and asked if something had occurred. The gentleman validated that he held vital data to convey. Felminia rapidly guessed that it was linked to Suim, and the gentleman validated her hunch. As Felminia neared the invocation zone, she spotted that the sentry's plate armor resting there was completely smashed. The individual accompanying her observed that it seemed not only that Suim had been wandering around, but also voiced panic that he might attempt to injure the monarch. Felinia replied that the individual appeared to be leaping to verdicts. However, the individual clarified that it was merely a hunch, adding that Suimi seemed to harbor a deep resentment against the monarch since he had been helpless to return to his own world. The individual further mentioned catching Sui say that one day they would all perceive. They went on by notifying her that several trespasser identification mystical gear they had set up were ruined, particularly the ones near the monarch's resting quarters. Additionally, many eyewitnesses had reportedly spotted Suimi in that zone. Felminia was genuinely startled to gather the scale of Sui's purported deeds. When the individual asked whether something was amiss, Felinia rejected it. The individual then implied that the topic ought to be kept classified from the alternative palace sorcerers and comforted her that they would handle it. However, Felinia cut in, stating that she would scrutinize the topic herself. She voiced her appreciation for the data supplied over the past few days. The individual humbly replied that it was nothing, emphasizing that the domain was of premium importance and requesting solely to be of function to her. Felmania thanked them once again and said she would request their backing if required. After excusing herself, she exited, reflecting that if Suime genuinely intended to attack the monarch to vent his resentment, it would be both awful and unpardonable. Although Fulminia did not comprehend Sue's authentic objectives, she found herself questioning the conduct of the seemingly passive sorcerer. She trusted that Sue should soon make clear his deeds. Unbeknownst to her, the individual who had handed her this data, the identical person who had once vied with her to turn into Ra's preceptor, was secretly pulling the strings of the crisis, noting to themselves that the kernels had finally been embedded. A few days later, as our bro Soom walked through a hallway, a maidservant walked past him. Felina monitored the setting intensely and caught that he was utilizing some variant of sorcery. Abruptly, he vanished. Responding rapidly, she intoned a gale tracking spell and uncovered that Sue had breached the monarch's private grounds. Soom was standing in the courtyard recognized as Chalk Paradise, observing that he did not view tracking someone to be an excellent pastime, and that such conduct was suited solely for tragic and idiotic folks who did not comprehend how matters operated. Filmia comprehended that he had detected her attendance. Sue validated that she had been tracking him for quite a while. When she questioned his objectives, he replied that he had merely been taking a walk. He appended that since he was not authorized to exit the citadel at dark, he simply desired to visit a spot he had not seen previously. Felinia, skeptical of his explanation, and Sway May himself seemed conscious that his logic would not satisfy her. Felinia stated that she had arrived there with the identical objective as him, and confessed that she wanted to settle the topic in the most tranquil style possible despite being disliked by many. She confessed that she had never truly desired matters to intensify. Sue wondered aloud whether settling matters sooner would have been superior, as it would have rendered everything speedier. He implied that the dark was still fresh and that it was hour for them to commence. Filminia told him not to be idiotic and questioned whether he even comprehended where they stood, clarifying that it was Chalk Paradise, a spot deeply prized by the monarch. She asked whether he truly trusted they were authorized to battle there. Sue offhandedly observed that it was quite an imposing tag for a courtyard, which shocked her. She demanded to comprehend what drivel he was uttering. Scanning around, she detected that the eastern spire was gone. The throne tower was likewise nowhere to be spotted. Sue asked if something seemed to be lacking and implied that she looked more intensely. Felinia grew perplexed, recollecting that the throne tower ought to have been on the inverse side. She found the crisis impossible to grasp and wondered what was taking place. We then exposed that they were not in Shock Paradise. Felminia yelled at him not to mess with her, as the assertion was incredible. However, Sui went on by pointing out that the eastern spire manifested on the western flank and requested her to clarify it, though she held no reply. He then commenced intoning Phantom Road, clarifying that it was a boundary he had fashioned, an illusory domain where everything stood as a mirrored reflection. He further exposed that he had woven mathematical digits into the incantation, yielding a zone that did not belong to their planet, an intricate structured dimension. Fulminia was deeply perplexed, wondering what Sae was even chatting about and whether it was truly sorcery, as she trusted there was no incantation capable of shifting the world in such a style. Sui replied placidly, clarifying that he had not actually shifted the planet itself, but only what she was capable of seeing. He appended that there was nothing particularly mystifying about it, as it was simply a standard variant of boundary sorcery. Still perplexed, Felinia went on to gawk at him, which started to annoy Sue. He requested her not to look at him like that and questioned whether she even grasped the notion of boundaries or had been paying attention when he mentioned boundary sorcery. Growing annoyed, he observed that she must be spoofing and felt as though he were dealing with someone utterly blank. He then stated that he had already clarified plenty. He made clear that the spot they were in was not the chalk paradise she recognized, but an entirely distinct zone he had fashioned utilizing sorcery. Due to that, no matter how much she battled or utilized sorcery, no one outside would be capable of hearing or stepping in. After finishing his clarification, Sumi proclaimed that it was hour for them to commence. Felminia, however, grew irritated and observed that he had bypassed too many specifics, rendering it tough to fully grasp the crisis. She questioned whether he truly trusted he could defeat her at his present standard. As a palace sorceress, she claimed that she would never fall to someone banking on such cheap setups. She then proclaimed that she would display him why she was recognized as the White Flare, the flame that encapsulated the reality of sorcery. Sue appeared slightly perplexed upon gathering the tag, but Felmania had already commenced intoning. She summoned blazes that signified fairness, outlined as a force that balked at logic, a pale disaster structured from the reality itself. With that, she discharged her reality flare offensive towards Suimi. Sui offhandedly shifted his digits and popped. In a flash, Felminia's whole incantation dissolved, leaving both of them paralyzed. Felminia blurted in shock, questioning how her blazes had dissolved. She maintained that it was her peak flame, something solely those who had reached the reality could govern. Fume, however, seemed mystified by her assertion. He had initially assumed that her reality linked to some hazardous or sophisticated method. But in his perspective, it was nothing past regular fire intensified with oxygen to slightly speed up its spreading. There was no hex integrated within it, nor any profound definition written into the spell. He further reasoned that without a proper bedrock or lore backing its starting point, such sorcery would never hold authentic strength. He even thought that if he were her preceptor, the initial item he would execute would be to hammer the bedrocks into her. Fulminia, growing increasingly perplexed, wondered what precisely was deficient in her sorcery. Sue bluntly replied that everything was deficient, equating her capabilities to nothing past a fire thrower and even dubbing it inferior to one. His biting remarks left Felminia both perplexed and wounded. Without halting, Sue structured multiple mystical arrays beneath himself, shocking her even extra. Felminia questioned how such fatal mystical arrays had appeared so abruptly and demanded to comprehend what he was executing. Suime offhandedly countered that he was merely executing a regular method, transmuting it into a spoken formula. Felminia declined to trust him, maintaining that there was no path such a setup could be deemed regular and questioning how he was capable of fulfilling it. Annoyed, Sum observed that if he had to clarify everything from the starting line, the clarification would never terminate. He additionally condemned the mystical grasp of her world. However, after a minute, he begrudgingly resolved to clarify. He stated that he had triggered the method in advance by uttering certain ingredients. By building a segment of the method beforehand, it triggered friction within the universe itself, permitting the bedrock of the sorcery to form even before the mystical array fully surfaced. As a result, the mystical array would automatically spark, allowing him to utilize sorcery instantly. Fulminia tried to digest his clarification, but still paused. Sui questioned whether she truly found it impossible to grasp, reminding her that she had just observed it with her own eyes. He appended that if she could not welcome such reality, he could not validate her as an authentic investigator of enigmas. He underscored that streamlining the utilization of sorcery was vital in conflict. He further mused that while her world was one of blades and sorcery, his native world was far more sophisticated and fantastical by comparison. Felminia started to wonder whether sorcery could truly be streamlined to the standard where it no longer needed any spoken formula at all. In reply, our guy released a sliver of his capability and questioned whether what she had exhibited earlier was truly deemed high-tier sorcery in her world. He recognized that broad-scale spells were a distinct topic, but he seemed unimpressed, hinting that her exhibition was far from spectacular. With a regular pop of his digits, he discharged his capability once more. This time, Felmania was visibly startled, realizing that he had not utilized any keywords or spoken formulas whatsoever. Du dismissed the classic strategies as foolish and advanced to trigger what he dubbed Archaeardius overload. Instantly, a grand wave of capability burst from him. However, he made it transparent that he held no objective of going on with his clarifications, as he no longer felt like answering her queries. Instead, he proclaimed that it was now his turn to exhibit. Felmania found it tough to trust what she was monitoring. Sui's capability far outmatched not only hers but additionally that of Rai and even the Fiend Lord himself. Sui then observed that since landing in that world, he had never properly introduced himself. He told her that she was blessed to gather the reality. He was a sorcerer, an investigator of enigmas from contemporary Japan, someone who aimed to unlock the logic ruling that world. Catching this, Felinia was left completely amazed. Felinia tried to discharge her capability utilizing the reality flare, but Soom utilized his mystical array to make it dissolve. While he appeared laid back, she launched alternative offensive with blazes. However, Soot rapidly shut the gap between them and punched her, causing her to tumble back. She was shocked and wondered how he could utilize sorcery so flawlessly. In reply, Sue observed that she would lose if she could not deploy her capabilities properly, adding that it seemed she was anticipating a turn-structured conflict. He then extracted a capsule and intoned, transmuting it into a blade. Felminia blocked with a boulder raid, but Sue smashed it with ease, leaving her paralyzed. Checking the blade, Soom clarified that in his world, mastering close-range combat strategies was vital. Felminia floundered throughout the clash. After some trades, Soom monitored that she banked solely on sorcery and failed to keep gap from him. Both of them went on intoning their capabilities, and after a bit, Soom utilized a brief formula, extracting capability from the definition behind the terms. He noted that the concept of lengthier spells being more productive had turned archaic. He lastly struck her, causing her to drop. As the blade dissolved, he questioned whether the clash was finished. At that split second, Fulminia realized there was a massive mystical array beneath her, structured by Suime's intoning. It was so intricate that she could not parse it. More mystical arrays ringed her, even manifesting in the heavens. Sui addressed her as the palace sorceress and recommended her to shield herself with everything she held. He then discharged Nth Astral, striking her from every angle. Despite her exertions, the massive offensive intensely wounded her. Lastly, Sui aimed his blade at her throat and proclaimed that it was his triumph, asking if she held any protests. She even dubbed him a brute, contending that despite holding such grand capability, he had declined to combat against the Fiend Monarch. She maintained that if he had joined the clash, the Fiend Monarch could have been defeated. Soom responded by wondering if she was brainless, reminding her that he had already clarified how headcounts rule the resolution of clashes. He stated that no matter how robust an individual might be, they could not crush an infinite headcount of adversaries. He further made clear that they were not only facing the Fiend Monarch Nakshatra, but additionally the infinite fiends under his leadership. Their adversaries outnumbered them by double, triple, or even thousands of fold. And even with alternative prime combatants, there was no promise of triumph given such balances. Felmania contended that, with such mighty sorcery, falling should not even be a likelihood. She questioned how someone with his standard of capability could talk so gloomily about falling. Sui replied that in his world, such capability was barely deemed notable, and repeated that combat strength shifted greatly depending on headcount. He appended that he had already realized from the starting line that sorcery in this world was far behind his native domain. Chatting candidly, he confessed that he disliked fighting when the balances were transparently against him. He further observed that sorcerers ought to assume accountability for their deeds with their own existences. At that juncture, Felinia was left speechless and abruptly collapsed emotionally, pleading for pardon. Suime monitored that she had earlier been prepared to terminate him, yet now she was begging for her own existence. She rapidly made clear that she had not intended to terminate him, but only desired to lecture him. Soom welcomed that clarification as authentic. She then pledged in the name of the Divine Mother to assert her terms. Soom noted that as an outsider, he did not fully grasp the scale of such an oath, yet she went on to beg for clemency. Realizing that he might have pushed her too hard, he passed her a pact and directed her to consent to its clauses. Filmanina hesitantly asked what the pact held. Sui clarified that the initial clause needed her to never expose what had transpired that day, and the secondary blocked her from disclosing that he was a sorcerer. If she consented to both clauses, he would spare her existence. Felmania shook, realizing that she had already informed the monarch about Su utilizing sorcery, and she wondered what she ought to execute. Su replied that it was startling. She had thought she could deal with someone like him without any backup setup, but appended that it was not a grand crisis. He pressed her to simply welcome the pact. She eventually gathered the paper, still dubious if it was truly welcome. Sui validated that it was, then aimed toward a spot and directed her to trigger it. As she obeyed, a heavy stress structured around her, compelling her to bow. Soom placidly comforted her that there was nothing to fret about. Perplexed, Felinia asked what he had executed. Soom clarified that since she had triggered the pact, she would pass away if she shattered the pledge. She was shocked by this disclosure. He appended that it would be tedious if the monarch were to discover the reality. Felinia maintained that Su had never noted such a clause previously. He replied that it was nothing intricate. She simply had to stay quiet and behave as though she recognized nothing about him being a sorcerer. Matching his logic, this was far more analytical than locking in a hopeless battle against the Fiend Monarch. Devastated, Felinia started to weep, calling him heartless. Our bro Suim, slightly perplexed, wondered if he had gone too far and weighed what he ought to execute next. He tried to soothe her, advising her to keep her pledge, as he would feel awful if he were compelled to terminate someone whose demise could have been bypassed. Subsequently, he utilized his capability to mend her. As he left, our guy reminded her once more not to lose sight of the clauses of their treaty. Sui shifted some interval away, reflecting that the crisis had completely thrown him off balance. He mused on how far behind the populace of that world were compared to him. What perplexed him most was the shortage of any lethal intent. He could not comprehend why she had managed a construct in such a style. He resolved that he would require to examine these matters more intensely. A few days later, Felinia went to the monarch's lounge. Monarch Almadios immediately wondered whether her visit linked to Suim. She validated that it was and mentioned that she had been monitoring him since their final clash. However, she paused to go on. Detecting her tension, Almadias questioned whether something had occurred to her. She rapidly replied that nothing was amiss. Sensing that she was keeping something back, Almadias firmly directed her to tell him everything without leaving out any detail. In reply, Filmia dropped to her knees and requested pardon for everything that had transpired. After some interval, Sui was summoned to Almadaz's room. He entered and politely excused his trespass, clarifying that he had arrived at the monarch's plea via servant. Almadios offered regrets for calling him in the center of the dark and noted that they were solo in the chambers. Sum replied that there was no requirement for such protocol from the monarch. Almadas then asked about the vestments Sum was sporting. Sum clarified that it was one of his few left properties and that in his world it was an academy outfit. He appended an apology for his look, deeming it unfit. Almadias appeared slightly startled but comforted him that there was nothing to express regrets for and told him to lift his face. After settling down, Sui wondered what vital topic needed such a confidential dialogue. Almadas then shifted the talk toward Felinia. Sui replied that he recognized Felinia as the one who instructed Rai and Mizuki and asked what the topic was regarding her. Almadas, keeping a solemn tone, asked what precisely Suim had executed to Felinia. Almadios requested Sui to supply a full story of what had unfolded between him and Felinia. In reply, Sui offered regrets and questioned whether Almadias was truly certain that he wanted to gather everything he was about to disclose. Almadias replied that he simply wished to recognize the reality. After a quick split second of quiet, the two traded glances, staying balanced. Sui monitored that Felmania had displayed no sign of exposing anything. Yet, Almadas somehow seemed to recognize a great deal. Almadas stated that he had already worked it out. Sui then clarified that Felmania had discovered he was a sorcerer even before he landed, and he had taken that window to ensure she would keep quiet about it. That matching his words was all that had transpired. However, since she was helpless to speak about it, he questioned how Almadas had managed to learn the reality. Almadas made clear that he had questioned Felmenia individually. Although she could not speak about the topic, she had kept her quiet. Recollecting the split second when she had begged for clemency, Almadas confessed that he had anticipated she might cross his mandates. Therefore, he formed a strategy. He told her to stay quiet if his guesses were accurate and to tip her head if they were not. Through that line of attack, he had been capable of understanding everything. Sui was startled by this. He realized that Felinia had indeed valued the pact, as she had not spoken a single word about it. Still, he questioned why Almadas had stepped into the topic at all. Almadias replied that he could have opted to overlook it, but if he had turned a blind eye and Felinia had lost her existence, he would have deeply repented it since she was his follower. It was his obligation to guard her. Sui replied that her existence was not at hazard as long as she stayed quiet. He appended that he had no dream to terminate someone needlessly, and with that he deemed the topic settled. However, Almadas stated that he recognized nothing about Sui. As the one who had invoked him, he felt it was vital to grasp who he was and what his objectives were. He cheered Su to speak uninhibitedly and comforted him that he would supply any backing within his capability. Su offered regrets for his earlier cheekiness and recognized that he was blessed to have met someone like Almadas. He said that he would answer as much as he was authorized to. When Almadas asked who he truly was, Su lastly disclosed that he was a sorcerer. In his world, sorcerers were comparable to investigators who analyzed enigmas. Whereas in this world they were dubbed mages. Sum clarified that the monarch had likely already gathered from his peers about certain indicators that were frequent in his world. However, he made clear that there stood a cloaked zone of sorcery unidentified to the public masses, consciously kept separate from cultural impact. Because of this, sorcerers did not execute their system publicly, nor did they plan to expose their existence to the crowds. Almados then questioned what had transpired at the split second when Felmania had tracked down Sui's profile. In reply, Sui confessed that he had not been entirely certain whether she had fully tracked down the reality. His chief focus at the interval had been how to ensure her quiet. While going on with his studying, he had formed a plan and deliberately structured a scenario to face her. However, matching Sue's words, Felmania had unexpectedly set up hazardous mechanisms, well-built structures mimicking horse units. As a result, he had been compelled to shield himself when she assaulted him, which ultimately guided to him smashing the incantation. Almadias was visibly startled, and soon went on by clarifying that he had realized Felmenia was not inclined to engage in a proper talk. He confessed that he might have operated somewhat excessively, but he justified it by saying that he was someone steered by sorcery, following his own codes. He held no intention of enduring a proud posture or roughness as a reply. He further stated that his actions were additionally a path of venting his frustration at being forcefully invoked into that world. Matching his words, it was vital for his tranquility of mind, and he held no intention of asking anything extra from them. At that split second, Sui rotated toward the spot where Felinia had been lurking. Realizing she had been spotted, she lastly stepped forward. Almadias, startled, wondered when Sui had figured out that she was present. Sui replied that it would have been unfeasible for him not to detect. King Almadias offered regrets while Felinia shook anxiously. Sui told her that she ought not to operate blindly and questioned whether she had already lost her balance. He appended that as an investigator of enigmas, she ought to stay watchful until her ultimate split second, explicitly since she stood for the benchmark profile that the domain looked up to. He additionally observed that she ought to be thankful to the monarch for venturing himself on her behalf. Gathering this, Felmania turned visibly moving. Soom then turned to Almados and implied that they go on with the talk with the relevant entities. The setting relocated to Rai and Mizuki, who were locked in their drills while monitoring the sovereign's sentries. Mizuki carried fluid to Rigai and lauded him for his intense labor. Regi concurred, voicing certainty that they would soon merit their status. However, he additionally voiced shock that Felmania had abruptly stepped down from her post. Mizuki concurred, observing that Felmania had always been gentle, and appended that she had always desired to watch Felmania's sorcery up close. Felinia's challenger intercepted everything and backed into a chamber where he started chuckling maliciously. He thought to himself that Felminia had lastly gotten her lesson. She had dared to cross him straight to turn into Rage's preceptor, and it had all commenced when she shamed him in front of the savior and even the royal lady. He mused that he had never anticipated it would be so effortless to guide Felinia. In his perspective, the savior's fragile companions could never constitute a real hazard to the monarch's protection. Matching his blueprint, Felinia had ended up steering her malice toward Sue, as he had quietly poked her and utilized a dash of sorcery to hoodwink her. He additionally trusted that it had been far too early for her to be bestowed the rank of palace sorceress. Yet, instead of being penalized more intensely, she had merely been removed from her post, which to him displayed how firm the monarch could be. He envisioned how irate the monarch would turn if someone injured those he prized most. Recollecting the setting in the hearing lounge, he found a sense of delight in remembering Fulminia's look. Her face had been packed with grief when the monarch openly declared her removal in front of all the palace sorcerers. As he wallowed in his reflections, he abruptly caught a voice observe that Felmania had been far too packed with herself. The gentleman concurred zealously, shouting that it was only instinctive. She had been proud and oblivious of her status, and he had successfully stripped her of her rank as a palace sorceress. Only then did he comprehend that he was not solo. When he rotated around, he discovered our bro Sui already perched in the chamber. Sui placidly requested him to go on, hinting that there was surely more he desired to voice. The palace sorcerer was paralyzed by his attendance. Sui presented himself, noting that it was their initial direct dialogue. The gentleman grew irate and demanded to recognize how Sui had tracked him down. Sui replied that it was nothing past a basic mystical stunt, much like the one the gentleman himself had utilized on Felinia. Shocked, the gentleman tried to process his remarks. Sui then disclosed that he was a sorcerer, and stated that he planned to settle the topic utilizing his own more sophisticated format of sorcery. Sui observed that one ought to initially comprehend the broader framework after executing a proper scrutiny, since the palace had managed the topic rather poorly. Having gripped the scenario, he utilized this grasp as part of a blueprint, feigning to wash the gentleman of doubt while actually unmasking him. He told the gentleman not to mask blind, adding that the monarch was already conscious of everything. The gentleman questioned what verifications Sui held. In reply, Sae stated that the gentleman had nearly hoodwinked him, and was in reality the one who had embedded those minor alterations into the mechanisms. Although the gentleman went on to behave as if he recognized nothing, Sui cautioned him against such conduct. He clarified that the crafter of those devices was a master of construct direction, and therefore it was unfeasible for them to operate in the style the gentleman claimed. The gentleman grew progressively restless and demanded to recognize how Sumi had gathered such data. Sui hinted that the monarch was already notified and that attempting to terminate him now would be nothing past a futile deed of harassment that would harvest nothing but trouble. He appended that such conduct was anticipated as it fell in line with the gentleman's initial blueprint driven by self-centered aims and minor vengeance. The gentleman then asked what Sui or rather Ray planned to execute with him. Sui made clear that the verdict did not belong to him, but rather to the person most targeted who held the privilege to settle the gentleman's destiny. At that split second, Felinia entered and declared that everything was the deed of the palace sorcerer. Sui recognized her attendance, linking to her as their unique visitor, and noted that the crisis had taken an unexpected shift. As the palace sorcerer grew irate, Sui mandated him to stay quiet, stating that someone who triggered pain on others out of mere jealousy and spite was unworthy of keeping the rank of palace sorcerer. He wrapped up by claiming that they would expose the whole of his blueprint before the monarch. The palace sorcerer grabbed an opportunity to shove Felminia aside and tried to slip away. Sui rapidly shifted to collar him, wondering why he was trying to flee. Felinia offered regrets, clarifying that everything had transpired too abruptly. Sui questioned her once more, asking whether she was truly not a sorceress. Feeling shamed, she confessed her error and offered regrets. Soon subsequent, they both darted out to track the fleeing mage. As they sprinted, Sue caught that something was bothering Fulminia and asked her what was amiss. She replied that she needed to express regrets to him, clarifying that even if she had been hoodwinked, her deeds had triggered him trouble, and she sincerely repented her constant cheekiness. Sui told her not to fret, reminding her that they had already settled the topic earlier. He confessed that it had been his error for creeping around while trying to discover a path back, and he did not fault her for her slips. He additionally recognized that he had hoodwinked her as well and offered regrets for going too far. Felinia, startled, maintained that he held nothing to express regrets for. She pointed out that not only had he pardoned her blind behavior, but he had additionally granted her the window to penalize the authentic architect. In her perspective, she was the one who ought to be expressing regrets. Sui dismissed her focus, reflecting that he might have misread her. Fulminia grew perplexed, and Sue, feeling slightly blameworthy once more, offered regrets once more for overreacting. Shamed by the scenario, she turned bashful. Sui then implied that they abandon the topic for later and center on shifting forward. He soon realized he had lost track of the palace sorcerer and wondered where he had gone. Felmania implied that he might have steered toward the northern tower. Although it appeared to be a dead termination, she exposed that there was a hidden portal and that the room was the identical spot where they had originally been invoked. When they arrived, they found the mage already present, discharging his capability. Felmania pressed him to yield, but he merely grinned, prompting her to question what he found comical. He mockingly linked to her as a green girl from the Orient and asked whether she truly trusted he would trap himself without a blueprint. Proclaiming himself a palace sorcerer, he claimed to hold a path to break the gridlock. He then triggered a mystical array around them, pumping his capability. Felminia was perplexed by the abrupt shift, and Beta shouted, asking what he had executed. It turned clear that the array was the identical variant utilized to invoke saviors from alternative planets. The mage validated this and clarified that if saviors could be invoked, then alternative entities could be pulled forward as well. Felminia, still perplexed, questioned his objectives. The mage exposed that he intended to invoke something mighty enough to render folks like them obsolete. She guessed whether he had simply fled to ensure his safety, teasing that it would be tedious if he finished up invoking something as basic as a barn of mounts. Annoyed, the mage snapped at her to halt teasing. He declared that just because she could utilize sorcery more expertly than him, she ought not to deem herself dominant. He indicted her of robbing from him the pride of invoking saviors and shaming him openly because of that insult. He wrapped up that she would have to pay with her existence. Felinia cautioned the man to anchor his tongue, indicting him of being a snob who had been drained by prestige and wealth. Suimi, having caught her, observed that she was not the solitary one capable of utilizing such sorcery. This left Felmania temporarily perplexed. Meanwhile, data had already been spread by the Redemption Order and the Sorcerers Association, directing all palace sorcerers to be ready to execute the invocation spell in case anything occurred to the mage tasked to invoke the saviors. More critically, their focus was to halt any illicit invocation. Felminia soon realized that Sue was not actively trying to halt the man and indicated this. Sue replied that he was in reality steering the scenario. However, Felmania objected, clarifying that the invocation spell had already been shifted from its primal setup and questioned whether he truly grasped what was taking place. Sue confessed that he could not halt it. As Felinia eyed him in total disbelief, he clarified that he had been attempting to shatter the spell by popping his digits repeatedly, but a mighty defensive boundary had been integrated within the invocation array. This boundary not only anchored whatever was being invoked, but additionally blocked any external friction or ruin. Shiva was startled to hear this, and Sue appended that even if they somehow managed to freeze the setup, it would likely guide to disastrous results. Since the array had been altered to invoke entities from alternative planets, it had effectively turned into a wild invocation. Such a spell could bridge to a volatile or savage realm. Once the portal unlocked, an opposing force would surface, and if the invocation were frozen, that force would bounce back fiercely toward them.